This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games, but into the milieus created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, their major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. In 1978, author of the Myth Adventures, Robert L. Asprin, of the Dorsey series, Gordon R. Dickson, and Lynn Abbey, who Dungeons & Dragons novel readers may recognise from her work connected to the Dark Sun and Forgotten Realms settings, conceived of a shared world in which several authors could use as background for their stories. This shared world is where our journey takes us today. So welcome to the city of Sanctuary. Welcome to Thieves World. As noted in the introduction, the concept of a shared world for authors came about in 1978 between Robert Asprin, Gordon R. Dickson and Lynn Abbey. The idea was born from the recognition that, when an author wishes to create a story with a rich background, a certain amount of world building is required up front, thus taking an author's time away from putting their story ideas to paper off the bat. Such a shared world, the trio considered, would save authors from much of this world-building effort, providing the base weavings of a tapestry onto which that they could add their own colourful threads. Some semblance of this idea had been constructed by Michael Moorcock with his Jerry Cornelius character and his many incarnations. That is, elements of the Cornelius persona and the broad multiverse in which he existed were put out by Moorcock for other authors to pick up on. Many of these elements were, however, more about narrative styling than physical backdrop. With Thieves World, this physical backdrop was provided in the form of the city of Sanctuary, a melting pot metropolis on the border of an expanding and ultimately failing empire, filled with twisting alleys and a broad cityscape. Only the barest of specific details were laid out for Sanctuary. In 1979, the first volume in the Thieves World series was published, including 8 short stories, an introduction and an essay describing the process Asprin went through in order to bring the project to fruition. It's a fun read, and it really does give a sense of the frantic experience that he must have been having, attempting to coordinate different authors with different detail requirements, writing stories within this nascent shared world. That the authors involved were already writing interactions between their characters and the characters of other authors approached by Asprin, consequently giving the harried compiler headaches of continuity to manage, I find somewhat fascinating. From a conversation between the 3 authors of varying experience about how a shared world might save authors time in terms of world building, to a seat-of-the-pants manic period of finding authors to participate, getting those authors to share their ideas, enough for them to all bounce off each other, to finally producing the initial publication, is an effort Asprin deserves huge accolade for. Authors involved in this first volume include Asprin himself, plus Marion Zimmer Bradley and Paul Anderson, figures that feature prominently in my own fantasy library, along with Lynn Abbey, John Brunner, Andrew Offert, John Haldeman and Christine DeWeese, who, other than Lynn, remain unread by me beyond their Thieves World work. It was a success. It was nominated for Best Anthology for Balrog, Locus and World Fantasy Awards, and it was a bloody good read. So it was obvious that a second volume would be coming, not in the least because famed science fiction and fantasy author Philip Jose Farmer had a tale in the works for the first volume that ran too late to be included in it. This second volume, Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn, a few pub names are better than that, arrived just a year later than its predecessor, in 1980, including 7 stories, an introduction and another essay by Asprin, this time titled The Lighter Side of Sanctuary. Along with Farmer, Abbey, Asprin, A.E. Van Vogt, Janet Morris and Offert, among the pantheon of authors this time around, was David Drake, he of Hammer Slammer's fame, another staple of my reading shelf. During this period, Chaosium became interested. They had published the role-playing game RuneQuest to much success and were working on a new game, Call of Cthulhu, that lifted from literature and brought it into the role-playing field, built on their basic role-playing system, itself an extract of the core concepts from RuneQuest. Thieves World seemed an obvious fit for role-playing, A city with enough detail for authors, or game masters, to draw upon, while open enough to inject their own imagination and flair, populated with a wide variety of characters already defined within the two compilations. But the spirit of Thieves World was one of collaboration, of different authors weaving their own ideas into Sanctuary. So how could a role-playing setting match up to such an ambition as that? It turns out the answer, at least in concept, was relatively simple. As Aspirin did for the story anthologies, so the project leads at Chaosium did for the role-playing industry. Designers from various corners of the industry, as it stood in the early 1980s, came together to contribute to the whole. Chaosium, then primarily Greg Stafford and Steve Perrin, wrote portions of the work, with Midkemia Press having forged a relationship with Chaosium via their Cities book and other supplements, which would later see Chaosium editions, writing around half of the meat of the work, the Games Master's Guide for Sanctuary. Robert Lynn Aspirin, Paul Anderson, Victoria Poyser, Mary Beth Miller, Jurek Chodak and Andrew Offit contributed short stories, prose and cartography for the Player's Guide to Sanctuary. These two works in themselves, included in the Thieves World box set, are remarkable. The key to the collaborative effort, though, is written largest in the Personalities of Sanctuary book of the set. Here, several characters from the anthologies are described, and then, in a separate section for each game, statted out in accordance to the rules of no less than 9 individual game systems: Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Adventures in Fantasy, Chivalry and Sorcery, Dragon Quest, Dungeons & Dragons, The Fantasy Trip, RuneQuest, Traveller, and Tunnels and Trolls. The veritable list of the prominent games of the time. But more! This was no simple creation of stats by Chaosium or Midkemia, with or without license. No. The authors of each section had some attachment to the system under scrutiny. Lawrence Schick, TSR luminary, wrote up the stats for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Dave Arneson and Richard Snyder handled Adventures in Fantasy, the designers of that system, and many of you will recognise Arneson's name from the original Dungeons & Dragons game. Wes Ives, a writer for Fantasy Games Unlimited, set things down for Chivalry and Sorcery. Dragon Quest designer Eric Goldberg wrote, unsurprisingly, the Dragon Quest entry. Steve Marsh, another TSR luminary of the time, wrote up the stats for Dungeons & Dragons. Designer Rudy Kraft, who some of you may know from RuneQuest, Griven Mountain, and Flying Buffalo's City Book series, set down the numbers for the Fantasy Trip. Steve Perrin naturally laid things out for RuneQuest, and Mark Miller, creator of Traveller, worked with Mary Beth Miller in order to bring Traveller stats to Thieves World, including the world's universal planetary profile, obviously possessing a 0 lore level. And the inimitable Ken St. Andre brought his game, Tunnels and Trolls, along to the party. Well, all of this means that, involved in one way or another within the Thieves World box set, were Chaosium, Midkemia, TSR, Metagaming, SPI, Flying Buffalo, Fantasy Games Unlimited, Game Designers Workshop, and Adventure Games. Can you imagine such disparate companies coming together in the current cutthroat world of the RPG industry, not just with systems, but in providing authors and permissions? While I love Sanctuary as a place, I love this set even more because it is a snapshot of a period where gamers were gamers regardless of which system or systems you played, a time before the corporations moved in. That is, of course, not to say that every game these days has a corporation behind it, but the shadowed effect extends even over those that do not. Small fish competing in a big pool still, nevertheless, need to compete. The Thieves World saga continued in further anthologies through to 1989, 12 volumes in total, with Chaosium releasing a Thieves World companion, this time only with RuneQuest, Rollmaster and Middle-earth role-playing stats, reducing the collaboration to Chaosium, Midkemia and Iron Crown Enterprises, and bringing elements of the background material up to date with the anthology series at its time of release in 1986. Alongside the anthologies, several novels were also published, both official and unofficial, and FASA, renowned at the time for producing third-party supplementary material before they hit their stride with games such as Battletech and Shadowrun, produced 5 adventures under approval from Chaosium through 1982: The Blue Camel, Traitor, Spirit Stones, Dark Assassin, and Vengeance. Certain tales of Sanctuary were adapted into comic form by Starblaze Comics through to the mid-1980s, and the anthologies themselves have been variously collected into omnibus form at various points, beginning with Sanctuary in 1982, collecting the first 3 anthologies into a single hardback form. After a hiatus of over a decade and a divorce from Robert Lynn Asprin in 1993, Lynn Abbey made a return to Thieves World. This started with her novel, Sanctuary, leading into 2 new anthologies, Turning Points in 2002 and Enemies of Fortune in 2004, featuring authors Mickey Zucker-Reichart, Andrew Offord, Diane L. Paxson, Selena Rosen, Dennis L. McKayman, Robin Wayne Bailey, Jodie Lynn Nye, Jeff Grubb, Raymond E. Feist, C.J. Cheriet, Jane Fancher, Ian Gray, Stephen Brust and Lynn Abbey herself. In 2005, Green Ronin, famous for their Freeport City setting and the Mutants and Masterminds superhero game, brought Sanctuary to the D20 system, aka Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, with the Thieves World Player's Manual. They followed this up with the Shadowspawn's Guide to Sanctuary and the Thieves World Gazetteer, and Murder at the Vulgar Unicorn in that same year, and Black Snake Dawn in 2007. Personally, I found these disappointing. Fair enough products as far as the metric 1,000 tonne of material released for the D20 logo, but missing that point of collaboration which, for me, Thieves World embodies, be that between authors within their anthologies or authors and game companies within the superlative Chaosium set from 1981. Although the Green Ronin project involved Lynn Abbey, it failed to invoke the setting in the same way as its predecessor, perhaps because it seemed to live in the shadow of Green Ronin's more extensively supported Freeport City setting. Robert Lynn Asprin left our particular world in May of 2008 at the age of 61, leaving behind the often underappreciated legacy of Thieves World and, of course, the sense of fun he brought to fantasy with the Myth Adventures series. These days, the Thieves World tales can be enjoyed as audiobooks and Kindle omnibuses. Thieves World, as a setting, focuses on the city of Sanctuary. The city sits on the edge of the Rankin Empire and is nominally part of it for a period within the early anthologies and the original Chaosium setting. Here it collects those individuals of a roguish quality who largely adventure within the city's wards, interacting with each other, and the various circumstances of Sanctuary itself suffers, often the fallout of events occurring beyond its walls, such as the sacking of the Empire by the Dark Horde. Its position as a sort of edge of Empire outpost has meant that it collects and absorbs various cultures from the, in the main, only vaguely described world beyond, making it a melting pot of many peoples, ideal as a setting for, say, numerous authors to share and as a basis for an interesting fantasy urban role-playing environment. Inevitably, we must compare Sanctuary to other stalwart cities of fantasy fame. It is far smaller than the city-state of the Invincible Overlord, Lankhmar, Greyhawk and Waterdeep. If you want to run the numbers for comparison, here is the general ranking, with huge caveats and approximations. So Lankhmar is around about 140,000 individuals, or 7,000 smokes. Waterdeep clocks in at about 130,000. Baldur's Gate, again of the Forgotten Realms, with 120,000. The city-state of the Invincible Overlord, from the Wilderness setting, clocks in at around 80,000. Greyhawk, at last time it was censored in gaming material, 69,500. Neverwinter, around 23,200, and Sanctuary, around 20,000. But size isn't the point. Within a vast city, most of the population is simply faceless background furniture. Within Sanctuary, although you'll still get thousands of furniture characters, the city's enclosed and compact state means that there are greater opportunities for recurring character interactions. From a gaming perspective, it is not so large as to be unknowable. A good game set in Sanctuary has the players becoming familiar with the twists and turns of even the maze. They can get to know the place, building by building, instead of merely street by street or ward by ward. With regards to prominent characters and figures, there are plenty here. described not just in role-playing materials, but brought to life by their creator authors within the anthologies and novels. Thus does the city come alive, with plenty of material to dress the game statistics. This then, for me, is the primary feature of Thieves World, the city of Sanctuary, a relatively easy to bring to life, tangled web of a seedy city populated by a plethora of colourful characters, just ripe for an enterprising game master to add his or her own stamp on that roster and on the progression of the city's fate. It doesn't really matter much what the rest of the world is like, only what effect it has on the city itself. And you don't need minutiae on the royal court of rank to be able to figure that out. A sense for much of the city can be gleaned from the places such as the Shambles in York, one of my favourite places, at least before the Harry Potterites filed in, and that gives Sanctuary a feeling of familiarity and claustrophobia all at once. If we compare Lankhmar and Sanctuary as literary cities, much of Lankhmar passes by in the narrative. Its scenery and the focus of Leiber's stories is very much placed on Fafard and the Mouser as characters. With Sanctuary, very likely because of the revolving door of authors who have contributed to its library of novels and especially short stories within the anthologies, the city becomes more of a character of its own. The characters of the story are more transient, killed off in some cases, while the city is a constant. An ever-changing constant, but it is the permanent fixture that binds the multitude together within its alleys. If you enjoy urban adventures where the action moves from street to alley and interaction between prominent figures of the population is key, then yes, it is. If cities, to you, are more scenery, buildings, simply another form of dungeon wall, or you prefer such places to be more abstract places for characters to heal up and buy gear between their adventures, then perhaps not so much. If you prefer games that mix things up more between environments, then while there is room to develop the region beyond the city, it will require effort to create that kind of game. But the vague details regarding the city surroundings are of a benefit too. Sanctuary can be dropped into almost any fantasy setting, with tweaks here and there to its history and the nature of its external influences. There is no reason why Sanctuary couldn't, for example, stand as a surrogate for Highport within the world of Greyhawk. If you can get hold of a copy of Chaosium's original set for a reasonable price, I will leave it to individuals to decide what, to them, is reasonable, then I would urge you to do so. This set, for me, goes beyond Thieves World and Sanctuary, and stands as a monument to a period of role-playing history that I cherish very dearly, when luminaries from the spheres of Dungeons & Dragons, RuneQuest, Traveller, and more could contribute to a project with few, if any, lawyers present. It was just over a decade later when TSR would gun for GDW over Dangerous Journeys, and many RPG companies battened down their hatches to weather the hard times of the mid to late 1990s alone. While Thieves World is a great setting and a fun series of stories to read, for me, it is a reminder of halcyon days as a role player.